Is recording.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Good evening. This is an informal meeting of the Gardner City Council on Monday, May 4th, 2020. The purpose of the meeting is to discuss the possible rescheduling of the special preliminary election and the special city elections to fulfill the vacancy of the position of mayor. And before we begin, pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 20, and the Governor's March 15th, 2020 order imposing strict limitation on the number of people that may gather in one place. This meeting of the informal meeting of the Gardner City Council will be conducted via remote participation and broadcast live on Gardner Educational Television, Channel 8, and the Gardner City Hall's YouTube channel. The audio or visual recording, transcript, or other comprehensive record of proceedings will be posted on the city's website as soon as possible after the meeting. I will call this meeting to order, and since this meeting is being conducted via Zoom, I'd like to ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Yes, Councilor Boone. Councilor Boone is absent. He did indicate in an email about an hour ago that he would not be able to attend tonight's meeting. Councilor Boudreau.
Present.
Councilor Craig Cormier.
Present.
Councilor Ronald Cormier.
Present.
Councilor Dernalowitz.
Present.
Councilor Graves. Councilor Graves.
Present.
Thank you. Councilor Hardern.
Present.
Councilor Mack.
Present.
Councilor Tyros.
Present.
Councilor Walsh.
Present.
President Kaczynskis.
Present. We are meeting informally tonight to discuss postponing the May 12, 2020 special city preliminary election and the June 9th, 2020 special city election and rescheduling the elections. I'd like to begin with an outline of our current state of affairs relative to the topic of this meeting. Our election has been rescheduled once already from the preliminary originally scheduled on April 7th to its current date of May 12th, and the special election from its original date of May 5th to June 9th, due to several reasons associated with the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that we are under a state of emergency declared by Governor Baker. The governor has now extended the emergency orders through May 18th. The city clerk manages the elections and has provided the city council with information explaining the options if we decide to postpone the election. The state requires it to be rescheduled on or before June 30th, and the council has to vote no later than 20 days before the date of the preliminary. The information the clerk provided us with shows if we're going to have the preliminary on May 26th and the final election on June 23rd, then the vote would be certified on July 11th when the new mayor would take office at 5 p.m. and we would have to vote this evening on that date. I'd like to make note that May 26th is the day after Memorial Day and no mail is delivered on Memorial Day, which would cause an issue with the clerk's office processing early voting ballot applications that would have been received on Memorial Day if mail were to be delivered that day by noon, which then they could send ballots to people they had received applications from. If we're going to have the preliminary on June 2nd and the final election on June 30th, then the vote would be certified on July 10th when the new mayor would take office at 5 p.m. and then we would have to vote by May 11th on that date. Additionally, the rescheduled election information has to be posted by state requirements 20 days before the election, which would be May 6th, which is this Wednesday, for a May 26th preliminary and May 13th for a June 2nd preliminary. Also, the last day to register to vote has to be rescheduled 10 days before the preliminary, which would be May 15th for May 26th preliminary and May 22nd for a June 2nd preliminary. Lastly, on this matter, the voter registration session notices would have to be published in the Gardner News for 2 consecutive weeks prior to the voter registration session date in order to provide voters and residents with ample notice to either register to vote or to make changes to their voter registration. So in speaking with the city clerk, he has expressed his concern for the health and safety of poll officials and voters. Many of his poll officials have expressed to him that they are most comfortable working after May 18th, when the governor's extension of the orders have expired. And the clerk's office is prepared to follow all of the guidelines issued by the governor to run a safe and efficient election, but he does feel that it is necessary to take seriously into consideration the concerns raised by the poll officials. So when taking into consideration the timeline of information that we have presented to us, that May 26th is the day after Memorial Day, and the issue that will be raised by the early voting ballot applications that will not be able to be received on May 25th by noon. And then there's also the concerns raised by the clerk and poll officials regarding the governor's extension, and then those as well relative to our voters. I'm going to suggest to postpone the preliminary to June 2nd and the final election to June 30th, taking into consideration the concerns, again, raised by the clerk and the poll officials. So those are my thoughts on it. I would want to postpone, and those are the dates that I would recommend. And I would like to know who would like to share their thoughts. Councilor Cormier.
Just a couple of things. We saw not so long ago in Wisconsin when they didn't reschedule their election. There's been a serious number of people who got ill, whether it was directly or indirectly caused by it. It certainly has to be a consideration. Whichever date we choose, I think we should decide that this evening, and that being as fair as we can to the candidates. To postpone our decision as to when to reschedule it would be, I think, an injustice to our candidates. I would go along with the June 2nd with the June 30th final election, if for no other reason that we've already had to reschedule this a couple of times. So give ourselves a little bit more room on that end. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other thoughts? Councillor Walsh.
I have a question for the clerk, if I may. As I understand it, the concern about having the preliminary on May 26th would be that the Memorial Day is the day before, and it has to do not so much with receiving absentee or early ballots, but with processing applications for early ballots or absentee ballots. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it would be only those ballots, those requests for early or absentee ballots that if it wasn't a holiday would be received on the day before the election?
Yes, primarily. The voter sends in an application either on, this is by mail, Thursday or Friday. Typically, the post office is very good about getting them in the next day. Saturday, which we're not open, Monday is a holiday. They do not deliver on Monday. So anything processed in the post office that weekend, we would not receive until Tuesday, which is a day late for accepting absentee and early voting applications. So those voters would then be, if they wanted to vote, would have to go to the polls physically and cast their ballots.
As far as receiving absentee or early voting ballots themselves, you can receive those on the election day, am I correct?
Yes, as long as they return them by 8 p.m. and we are in the office, we will be checking the drop box out front. Obviously, if they get them on election day, they're not going to be able to mail them back. They'll have to have them delivered to City Hall via the drop box.
So the non-availability of mail on the day before doesn't affect the receipt of actual ballots, but only the processing of ballot applications?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. The other issue I wanted to raise, well, a couple of things. This would require, if we went to either of these dates, it would require that the council address next year's budget by way of a 1/12 budget for the month of July. And I understand that our auditor, John Richard, at least is on the call with us. And I'm wondering if he might be able to explain what that procedure would be to pass a 1/12 budget for next year, so that a new administration would, because a new administration wouldn't be in place until the end of the day on either July 3rd or July 10th, either 3 days or 10 days into the new fiscal year. So we'd have to make arrangements, and I'm wondering how that would work, if you could, Mr. Richard.
John Richard, are you there?
Well, I don't hear him.
I don't hear anything. Yeah, I don't.
Well, I know that that procedure is authorized by statute. And we wouldn't have to do it tonight by any means, but we would have to do it prior to the end of the fiscal year. And I was just hopeful that we could have an explanation of what that process would be, although it's not essential to the vote that we'd have to make. I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that we would have to take that step if we postpone it to either of these dates.
Yes, that's one of the reasons that I had asked John to be on the call. So
Well, it shows that he's connecting to audio now.
we'll see if he comes back on the call. Did you have anything further for now, Councilor Walsh?
Well, my concern is providing the new administration with as much time as possible to formulate a new budget for the upcoming fiscal year. Either of these dates limit that availability of time, but I think that the earlier the better. I agree with Councillor Cormier's position that we should vote, if we're going to postpone it to new dates, that we should choose those dates tonight to give adequate time for everybody to adjust.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else? Councillor Tyros, did you have your hand up?
I did, thank you. I watched this past week's Finance Committee meeting, and I was pleased with the early voting turnout figures that were given, and I also was very happy to hear the precautions taken by the clerk's office that they intend to use on Election Day. I think we made the right call initially when we postponed the election, and I think we know a lot more now than we did back then. But we shouldn't forget why we postponed, and it was for the health and safety of our community. I trust our clerk, and I want to make sure those polling officials feel safe, and the people who go to vote feel safe as well when they express their rights. So I'll also be supporting the June 2nd preliminary date move. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Boudreau?
So just a quick question to the clerk, if I may. So we know at this time that there's not going to be, as the governor put out today, that it's not just going to be off to the races on the 18th. Do you believe that you will have enough poll workers to, like, is the opening of some of the businesses and community going to alleviate the worry of the poll workers enough to run an election? I know it's a hard question to ask, but
I can't answer that question. A number of poll, I've already had 21 now poll workers tell me they're not going to work either way. That leaves me with 63 total. I need 60 to operate 6 per precinct. I had an indication, actually, I spoke with 2 wardens today, 1 precinct clerk today, 1 warden last week. And the closer we are to the end of the governor's date, the less we are to work the polls out of fear. They're all 70s, 80 years old. And if we postpone it, and again, we all pray and hope that the governor will see that come October 18th, May the 18th, that he can let up a little bit. But again, we can't let our guard down, and we still have to provide protections for the voters and for the poll workers. And again, I can't say that those that remain have not told me yet, but it's not to say that they won't decide they're going to be mine. I just don't know. I can't predict. I cannot predict.
Have you considered reaching out to maybe college students that are home right now and most of them not working to see if we could get a more of a younger grouping to volunteer to do this?
Well, if I have sufficient, if the number of the seasoned trained poll workers are willing to do it, I'll be okay. If I need to recruit people last minute, they're going to have to be trained.
Yeah.
So I'll need to set up some training session for them, because before each election, and we haven't been able to do this before this election, is we gather here in the council chamber on 2 different dates with all poll workers, and they have to go through mandatory training. And that's because each election is a little different than the prior one. Like a primary has multiple ballots. General elections have ballot questions. Municipal elections, the last one we ran was in November. There are multiple candidates on that ballot. This is a single ballot. And there's always little minor changes, or I have to reassure them of certain do's and don'ts. And it's good to have training ahead of time. So anybody I bring in at the last minute, I'm going to have to somehow train them, because it's not as easy just sitting there and say name and address. But there is a lot more details, as you've all seen voter lists. You've seen how to deal with inactive voters, how to deal with voters with an ID requirement, how to deal with voters with an EV, with an X, EV without an X, AVs with an X, AVs without an X. Speaking to questions, how to deal with observers. Regulations, it's a host of CMRs that we put together training packets and instructions for each poll worker, specifically for the duties that they're assigned. As they switch, they have to then acquaint themselves again with that position. Some are a little more complicated, some are less complicated. The precinct clerk has about a 25-page instruction manual. The warden has a 7-page instruction manual. It's not something that I can say, just sit there and because the last thing we want are any problems with how voters and their ballots are handled during an election. So that is a possibility, but it would be a very quick, fast turnaround time. And they'd have to sign up as employees. They have to go through a Corey background check, the whole 9 yards.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Anything further, Councilor Boudreaux?
Nope, that was great. Thank you very much, Mr. Clerk.
Councilor Walsh, I believe John Richard is online. John, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep. So Councilor Walsh, if you wanted to go ahead with John Richard.
Yes. John, I don't know if you heard my question earlier, did you?
I did. Yep, I did.
Okay.
Sorry, I had issues with my phone. So the 1/12 budget is actually taking last year's budget, which is this fiscal year, FY20, and dividing it by 1/12. And that's what we would use for the month of July for each line item. I'm trying to get more direction with the DOR. I talked to our rep this morning, and I asked, would we have to vote on that budget this year, the 1/12? She said no. The only thing they require is to let the DOR, the director of accounts, know what's the reason why you don't have your budget approved, which she said we have a really good reason. Basically, I asked her, do we need a letter? Is there a form? She said there's going to be a bulletin this week out explaining what is needed.
But apparently a vote of the council is not needed, would not be needed?
Yeah, exactly. Nope. Not for the 1/12 budget. Because we're basically taking the current year's budget, FY20, and just dividing it by 12. So we're not, they feel that budget's already been approved, so that's what we'd be using. Just again, and we would just have to inform the director of accounts, and I'm working on how do we do that.
Okay. Thank you. That answers my question.
Okay.
Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Okay, if there's no more comments, I'd like to call on each counselor and take a straw vote at this time. So please respond with May 26th or June 2nd to indicate your vote. Counselor Harder,
June 2nd.
Counselor Boudreaux,
June 2nd.
Counselor Dernalowitz,
June 2nd.
Counselor Graves, are you gonna vote on this?
Yeah, present,
Are you gonna vote on the straw vote?
present,
Counselor Mack,
June 2nd.
thank you. Counselor Tyros,
June 2nd.
Counselor Craig Cormier,
June 2nd.
Counselor Walsh,
June 2nd.
Counselor Ron Cormier,
June 2nd.
and I vote June 2nd as well. Thank you. Mr. Clerk,
Yes, that was 9, with June 2nd, and Councilor Graves present, and Councilor Boone absent.
thank you. So we have to take a vote on this at the regular meeting, but the sense of the council was here, so we have that for us. Does anyone have anything further to comment on the topic of the informal meeting? Counselor Walsh?
Just very briefly, as I understand it, there would be 2 votes, one to postpone and a second to set the dates and to pass the order of election.
Yes, that's correct.
That includes those dates. I believe we have both. We have that order for the election with the materials, as I understand it. Is that correct? Is that correct?
Yes. Any other comments? Okay, hearing nothing, we will close this part of the meeting and reconvene at 7:30 for our regular meeting. It is 7:22 right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.